I think one of the leading theories at the moment, then, we probably might as well talk about
Yeah,
integrated information, is this thing called integrated information theory, which is a really interesting of way to look at consciousness. A very objective way, but the key thing with it is it tries to quantify consciousness, which has never really been tried before in the same way. There may have been like other proto-theories and types of things, maybe.
Yeah.
But, this is the first one, I think, to make a really like serious effort to put numbers on consciousness and really,
or at least to take the first step to putting numbers on it.
Yes, yeah.
What they describe sounds like it's a quantitative system, and it sort of is, but they don't actually, as far as I can tell, they don't actually like put forward any way of actually.
No, they're hypothesizing of a method of doing it.
Yeah, sure. You can kind of think of it.
When was the first paper on it? It was like 2009 or something.
Yeah, something that's pretty recent.
It's quite recent, so it's a fairly recent thing that's started to gain more traction actually over the years.
Yeah. And this one of you guys pointed this out in a comment.
Oh yes, someone did.
Integrated information theory.
Yeah.
And like we'd heard about it before, but like that we definitely decided to dive into it again after seeing the comment. So cheers for that.
Connor Healy.
Yeah.
Thank you for that comment.
Yeah. And so you can kind of think of integrated information theory as a it was just a mouthful.
It is. You can call it IIT.
IIT.
I'm not sure. I keep getting that fumbled as well, though. IIT. Integrated information. I don't know a quick way of saying that. Anyway, let's just roll with integrated information.
Oh, God, and the language they use when you read some of those papers as well. Like, what is it? The intrinsically irreducible, like...
Yeah.
I can't remember.
And to be honest, once you get your head around what they mean, they're okay. It's just when you first start reading it, it's like...
So I think
like anything, when you get into it to start with, it takes a while to get used to the lingo.
Yeah. So integrated information theory, you can kind of think of it, or at least I kind of think of it as a way of almost redefining what consciousness is, right?
Yes.
And I don't mean redefining it from like what we described it as at the beginning of this, because consciousness as we experience it is still like sentience and self-awareness and all that stuff. But integrated information theory it's trying to explain how such a trait could emerge purely from like information processing.
Yes. Yeah.
In the most basic sense.
Yes. So how a system begins to take on characteristics like self-awareness.
Yeah.
Based on this kind of metric, what they call phi, which is how integrated...
It's like a Greek letter, phi.
Yeah. How integrated the information in a system is.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite difficult to explain.
Yeah, so so if you think of information as purely just like the state of something that affects like an outcome. So like for example, like the way light is reflected off of something is that's a way of like information being transferred.
Yes, yeah.
So that thing, the state of that thing, has affected the way that light's been reflected.
Yeah.
So like you can also think about like obviously
as particle. Or whatever.
Yeah, or so and taking it to the brain, like the way that certain neurons are like connected and the way that they fire.
Yes.
That's obvious. I mean, that's much more intuitively like that's carrying information.
Yeah.
Or like compute like bits in a computer.
Yeah, exactly.
Cascade of information, whatever. And the integrated part of it is the crucial thing. Like that's the absolutely crucial thing. So you can have a shitload of information.
Yeah.
Like a computer, like just churning through, just processing a ton of information.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's integrated is like the really, really crucial part that brings you this like level of this thing called phi, and like high levels of phi mean high levels of consciousness. And so we have like we have the highest level of phi. Yeah. Our brains are the highest phi thing.
Most phi rich
in the
objects.
Universe. Yeah, exactly. Delicious phi.
Yes, yeah.
So kind of analogy. I don't know. Again, like how well this was. I read this one, and it kind of holds. So like, if you imagine like you looking at a photo of an apple, and a camera. So a camera seeing an apple and you seeing an apple. The inputs are basically the same in the sense that like the light is going into the camera, and the light's going in your brain, like turn into digital images, whatever, in your brain or in the camera. But in your brain, the integrated part of it comes from the fact that you're seeing the light. So you're seeing like the physical object in front of you, but you're also using like memories of what apples are, like knowledge that it's food, like maybe like the fact that it's red like does something else. So all of this stuff
where it's come from, tree, you know,
all of this stuff like is integrated together to give you the conscious experience of seeing the apple.
Yeah.
Whereas all the camera has is a bunch of like pixel data, like amount of colors per pixel or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's not integrated information. You could like chop out a section of that picture and it would make just as much sense to the camera as the whole, you know, whereas your conscious experience of seeing that apple depends on all of those different things.
If you change the color of the apple, if you made a pink apple, then I've got more information on that object as an apple than the camera has, and can store about what the apple is to so the camera just takes a picture and it takes a picture. I look at it, I take like a mental picture and go, apple's pink, it's not right. Or I get hungry or whatever.
So the crucial thing is having integrated information, and like they describe it in the sense that, I mean, it's the language they use is mental, but it's like you can't, like, the information isn't divisible. Like that's the crucial thing.
It's a complex.
It's a complex that's totally interdependent.
Yeah, and so if you pull one bit of it out, it no longer makes sense as like an entire structure. Yeah. But basically, pull any part of that system out, and the whole thing doesn't work anymore. Yeah. The integration is the key part, and if you take one bit of it out, you won't understand the whole. That kind of concept. Yeah. So
you could have a computer that's like the most powerful like supercomputer in the world and just plows through data, just like crunching numbers. Yeah. But it's still like just in series, just churning through numbers. Yeah. It's not building up a structure of data of information that's all codependent on each other in its computery mind.
Yes. Yeah.
This is really hard to talk about.
I think that makes sense to
explain. But yeah, the
key thing is that you have modular parts that all feed into each other and all do different bits, and the information, like, you get more information the more integrated, the more interconnected, the more different parts relate to other parts. Yeah. If you pull any of those parts away, then you end up with less you don't end up with integrated information, you end up with, disparate parts that are no longer integrated, and that moves you closer to understanding what consciousness might like exist from,
emerge from, not emerge from, because that still makes it sound like it's a thing that comes out of it, but just like when you have something that has a high level of integrated information, you have a conscious system.
Yeah, that's what it posits. Yeah.
So that also means that anything. So if you extrapolate this all the way, like as far as it will go, you basically find that anything that has any form of information, like transferring capacity, has like a non-zero level of phi. And like by information transferring capacity, I mean it's basically anything in the entire universe.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that people tend to kind of latch onto about integrated information theory, is that it kind of says that consciousness is kind of everywhere and in everything.
Yes.
But that's not kind of really what it means.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't mean that in the classic...
It doesn't mean that in the classical sense of what people think consciousness is, or would consider consciousness to be. So because you've got these different, like... we're talking about these integration of different things. The more integrated it becomes, the more conscious it becomes. But that, like you said, you can't reduce that level to zero. There's no non-phi level of zero, because there's always some information that is somewhat integrated between, like, maybe a couple of particles or something like that. Yeah. Or is essentially non-zero in everything. So a photon has a level, according to this, a level of consciousness. Yeah. As does your iPhone, as does your lamp, as does your whatever.
But it's wrong to think about it as like, okay, that's got a rudimentary version of what we've got. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. It's much more accurate to think that what we've got is a much like crazy more complicated version of information transfer, rather than the other way around, if you see what I mean.
Kind of, yeah. So, yeah.
Which is the problem with using the word consciousness to talk about it.
The problem with the word consciousness is that traditionally it invokes... Like we talked about this self-awareness, it invokes to people when you say consciousness, it invokes the idea of like a human level consciousness. Yeah, it does. Yeah. And if you say like less conscious, you're kind of talking about animals and things. But even though you can draw the line between the two, possibly with integrated information between the photon and human consciousness, there's no they're so dissimilar.
Yeah.
That it's not like it's misleading because it makes people think that there's like their lamp is thinking about them.
Yeah.
Or that I don't know, a photon. If it kind of makes people think that there's like this conscious force that's like imbued in everything.
Yes.
And that's absolutely not what it's saying.
Absolutely not. No. At least not in the way that I understand it. Like.
Yeah. Actually, maybe I don't understand.
I don't think it is. No. Like from what I've read and sort of listened to by the people who've put forward this theory.
Yeah.
Like they are trying to get at this idea that all consciousness is a high level of integrated information.
Yes.
And that because anything is possible of transmitting information, then that process that from which consciousness eventually emerges, is everywhere.
Yeah.
And we just happen to exhibit a particularly integrated version of it.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons. Almost like that's why we said earlier we don't like the word consciousness particularly.
Yeah.
Because it has all this baggage attached to it.
It does.
Which makes it hard to describe things that are what you would consider normally, what most people would consider unconscious.
Yeah, like does that mean my light switch is like thinking about me or something?
And it's not really what they're saying.
No.
That it has anything similar. It's just that it has information. What it really is just talking about is information, the integration of information. Yeah. Consciousness is kind of like is what you would normally consider in normal discourse, normal language, common parlance, is that it's a conscious thing is like a real endpoint of integrated information, like an outcome of a highly integrated system,
like vastly more integrated than like anything else. Even like the most advanced like supercomputers, have nothing in terms of integration compared to like what mammalian brains have. Yeah. And other animal brains. Yeah. You can imagine like a graph of this phi thing, and it's just like a flat line,
which you can't see anything.
Which you can't see. Which is, I mean, I guess it does have a very shallow like increase.
It's nearly non-zero for ages.
Yeah, nearly just non-zero, whatever, and then just absolutely spikes at the last moment, and that spike at the last moment is like life on Earth basically, and everything else in the universe is like down on the flat end. Yeah. Yeah, or life on what other planets possibly.
Yeah, sure.
But what?
So people have used this to sort of say that integrated information theory talks that it posits that there's this like panpsychism thing.
Yes.
That's the word that they use.
Panpsychism, yeah.
As in that the universe is conscious.
Yes.
And that's misleading. It's because of what consciousnness. Yeah, because of what consciousness is defined as in integrated information theory. It is basically just a level of integration of information. So, like I said before, it leads people down the road of thinking that there's some kind of human level kind of type conscious experience, but all it's saying really is that things have kind of like a subjective experience, that like even like a photon, and that's kind of what they define as like consciousness, if you like, in this sense,
right?
In that like a photon has its own like position in space and time, and it has information that it's its own information that has come about from it, like integrating, or not integrating, but like basically touching or coming into contact with other things, and that have passed information to itself, which means it has like a subjective experience of the universe.
Yeah, so that's everything unique to it.
Yes, exactly.
Crucially, so like
has information passed to it that is internalized. Yes. And therefore it has kind of like a subjective experience of the universe. And so that's not really the same as like a kind of conscious kind
it's
of
not sat there thinking about something.
No, exactly. In the traditional kind of meaning of what people would think consciousness means, all it means is that it's just got its own like internalized subjective kind of part of the universe, subjective experience of the universe.
And once you start building that up into more and more layers and integrate it more and more, you end up with a system that we would recognize as being self-aware, but like crazy, way more complicated.
Yeah, and that's what they mean by panpsychism, is that there's that every like little kind of minutia of the universe, every quanta of it has its own kind of subjective experience. Yeah. So that's what I think they're saying.
Yeah, I think it is, and I like it. I think because and I'll tell you why. It's because what we were talking about last week and this bit earlier about how you can trace back. You can't see a point in human evolution at which consciousness suddenly appears, because there wasn't that point. That point didn't exist. It is a gradational thing, and as I said last week, like all our brains are doing is just centralizing processing of response to stimuli in this highly integrated way.
Yeah.
And you can trace that all the way back to what bacteria were doing in like the primordial thing, and still do, just responding to stimuli, just like getting some information from the environment, processing that and reacting to it.
Yeah.
But what this does is take that even further back.
Yeah.
And just says like,
and
okay,
which is
like,
of course true. Like a bacteria is just a chemical system that's grown.
Yeah.
It's very much developed from a.
I mean, it's an error to make a distinction between life and non-life, really, because there's a gradational thing there as well.
Yes.
There's chemistry that behaves in very complex ways and reacts to stimuli and does stuff like that. So that's, I mean, it's awesome. I really like that aspect of it, actually.
Yeah.
Which is unusual, which is strange, because that is the bit when I first read about it. That was the bit that I was like, whoa, what the hell?
Yeah.
But when I thought about it more, like I was like, okay, now I think
I really dig that part of it. Yeah. That part really makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And kind of, it's one of those things where you're sort of like, oh yeah, I mean, this just to me just sort of like, it's like they haven't solved it, but it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I can kind of understand like how this might develop. It may morph into something where we truly understand what consciousness is.
And it's cool because...
And it's the right way of thinking about it. That's the correct way to think about it.
I think
definitely is that you have a spectrum of absolutely of increasingly complex things. And there's no that it's gradational and that it's...
Yeah.
That's how you... Like any chemical evolution of any system, that's how you get closer to understanding the complex behaviours. Understanding the bits before.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So is if we're thinking about all these different things we've talked about, is integrated information kind of is that the one that we're sort of plumbing for at the moment in terms of an explanation for consciousness?
It feels like the most satisfying that I've come across.
Yeah, same to me.
Purely because it doesn't need anything else. Like it's not asking for like an extra like ingredient. It's not asking for like a non-physical kind of weirdness going on.
Yes.
It seems to suggest a way of just explaining exactly like what we're experiencing, just based on information processing.
Exactly.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, it tried to Occam's razor it.
Yeah.
And the whole problem of just like this is it's just integrating things in a certain way.
And I wonder because it's such a new thing. Like obviously it's going to get refined and talked about, and it's obviously making a bit of a splash. So more and more people will probably get starting to work on it and all this kind of stuff.
You will probably see inroads in terms of machine learning that will use integrated information theory to start trying to produce integrated artificial intelligence systems. We'll talk about that a bit more later. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe this will be a key to developing like an artificial intelligence. And actually as well, if we somehow work out that this is true, that like human consciousness does depend on, or it is totally like a function of integrated information, then it might make a way of us being able to like quantify the consciousness of everything. Like from like animals,
give it literally
be like, okay, this is how conscious this thing is. This is how conscious this thing is.
Yeah,
and including machines.
Exactly.
So like AI, so it'd be like, okay, is this a conscious AI? Don't worry about the Turing test and all that stuff. Don't need to ask a subjective human like, oh, what do you think about this machine being conscious? You just be like, okay, what's its phi level?
Yeah. And you could potentially do that. It would be incredible to build something like that. Would be you could potentially look at its sort of system of how it works and simply determine from the like blueprint of it essentially if it was integrated enough to be like classed as a conscious entity. Although again, bad use of consciousness. Consciousness is not a good word because it's any level on that spectrum. That's why you give it a number. To give it a phi number, to give it its phi level. You don't have to use the word consciousness then. That's my one problem with integrated information theory is that it should posit that it does posit that consciousness is this integrated information thing, but it should stop using the word, or at least have the word in its title, because saying that everything is conscious is not what most people understand consciousness to be. Yeah, and it makes it hugely misleading.
It's hugely misleading. I agree. Yeah.
But yeah, you could. I mean, a computer that's complex enough to have a phi level near an animal or near us. You probably aren't going to be able to. that type of thing is probably going to evolve on its own, as in you're probably going to give it like self-learning algorithms. It's going to go mental, and then you're going to come back with something and you don't fully understand how it works. For example, the search engine at Google, people don't quite understand like what that thing's doing because it's got so many layers of and so many inputs, and it's learnt so much over the years about how to like perceive images and stuff. Of course, they understand like what's gone into it, but it's done so much self-learning away from them that it's beginning to be difficult to really understand what it's doing.
So maybe something like that is already beginning to like raise its like phi level a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
On that spectrum, and also something like when we start seeing much more integration in cities, like so smart cities or whatever they would call it, like with where you have maybe loads of autonomous vehicles that are all networked, and like traffic flows all kind of centralized and all this stuff, and it's like monitoring various aspects of the city. That like that's going to be start to turn into like a high level of integration. Probably still nowhere near what's going on in human brains.
No, but if you have these self-learning algorithms like that DeepMind have been using to teach it how to beat everyone at that Chinese game Go or whatever it is, it's like incredibly complicated. It's got like trillions and trillions and trillions of different permutations per like moveset or whatever.
It's mental.
And they just taught itself how
to do it. It wasn't programmed to do it.
If you have similar self-learning algorithms that you give to a computer to then go away with all the information integrated from a city, not just a board, not just a crappy little like sort of like complex chessboard, but like a full city, it may raise its own file level from the amount of information it's integrating in. Well, we don't know where that sort of thing might lead. These are the kind of tiers of AI.
This is going to start convincing me that the singularity is around the corner again.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, we'll talk about this when we do an AI episode.
We absolutely will.
But integrated information could be a step along understanding how that could happen, and potentially a step along trying to imbue an AI that we create with some kind of understanding of like human like morality and things and things. You have to understand the problem is a muddy topic, but you have to understand the functions behind self-awareness of consciousness to start trying to build safely something like an AI. And integrated information theory seems to be it's the best stuff I've read so far, that I've been like, okay, this is something better than I've seen before.
It's the most, as I said before, it's the most satisfying explanation or step towards an explanation.
And although I may have misunderstood it all.
Of course. That is definitely possible.